The DOJ may be releasing the list of Jeffrey Epstein's clients?
It's sitting on my desk right now to review, done at the directive of the president.
You've probably heard before that President Donald Trump, along with other prominent leaders and celebrities, were on the so-called Epstein list.
Swore Epstein was either a witting or unwitting intelligence asset, and they may have had his plane wired up. They're the ones who have all this stuff.
Many in the media protected him. Why? Because of his relationships, who he knew.
Now the FBI is putting those theories to rest.
Child porn is what they were. Never going to be released, never going to see the light of day.
No evidence that could predicate an investigation against uncharged third parties.
Video was not conclusive.
On Monday, the DOJ released this video of Epstein's federal jail cell the night the disgraced financier died, but the time code jumps just before midnight.
The evidence prior to it was showing he committed suicide.
Time to drop the really big bomb. At Real Donald Trump is in the Epstein files. That is the real reason they have not been made public.
To him being an agent, I have no knowledge about that.
Me and Bongino and the folks, we will give you everything we can, and then we will have done our job.
And that's it on Epstein.
By now, we've all heard the headlines. The Epstein list doesn't exist. There is no client list. It's old news. Over 1,000 victims, but no third parties investigated. And, of course, Jeffrey Epstein committed suicide in his cell on August 10, 2019. These statements directly contradict sworn testimony, flight logs, and over 300 gigabytes of data and evidence seized from Epstein's property. Thousands of videos were supposedly recovered, and yet not a single other person besides Maxwell was named. This no-list narrative isn't about justice, it's about protecting the same elite network Epstein operated under. We were never going to get a list, and to understand how deep this network goes, we have to go all the way to the beginning. This isn't just about Epstein, it's about finance, surveillance, and global intelligence, and at the center of it is the Rothschild family. The Rothschilds weren't just bankers, they also invested in the education system in the United States, many social reforms, and they helped build the modern state of Israel. They financed early Zionist land purchases and infrastructure in Palestine in the early 20th century. This influence helped shape Israel's establishment in 1948. Today, their legacy continues to grow through global banking and surveillance, and it emerges especially in digital currency. Many believe families like the Rothschilds are shaping the narrative not to decentralize power, but to control it more effectively. During the Six-Day War, Israeli forces attacked a U.S. Navy signals intelligence ship, and as a result, 34 American sailors were killed. Official reports claim it was a mistake and that Israel didn't know who they were attacking, thinking it was an enemy ship. However, NSA intercepts suggest that Israeli forces knew exactly who they were targeting and that they knew it was an American vessel. Former CIA Director Richard Helms later even said, "I didn't think there could be any doubt that the Israelis knew exactly what they were doing." Israel would later even issue an apology and pay reparations to the U.S. But these suspicions and questions surrounding the attack never really went away. In 1974, a 21-year-old college dropout Jeffrey Epstein was hired to teach math at the elite Dalton School. Now, he had no degree, no credentials, and no teaching experience, yet he was hired by Dalton's headmaster, Donald Barr. 1 year before hiring Epstein, Barr published a sci-fi novel called Space Relations. In this book, there's like an intergalactic ruling oligarchy class that keeps child sex slaves for political and even personal reasons. The main character, an ambassador, is enslaved and then later becomes complicit in the same abuse. The book depicts underage grooming, forced breeding, and it's all written in a very disturbingly clinical tone. Now, obviously, many find the themes eerily close to what Epstein and Maxwell would later go on to do. It's especially strange when you start looking at the history behind Barr. In World War II, he served in the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor of the CIA. After that, he moved into elite education circles and began running Dalton as the headmaster. Which kind of begs the question, why would a man with intelligence ties give a man with no credentials, like Epstein, access to the children of New York's elite. Now, Donald Barr's son, William Barr, he was a former CIA employee in the 70s, but he would go on to be U.S. Attorney General under George W. Bush and under Donald Trump during his first term. William Barr was the man who oversaw the Justice Department when Jeffrey Epstein was taken into federal custody and subsequently died. It was under Barr's watch when Epstein's guards fell asleep or got distracted, surveillance cameras failed, logs were falsified, and his cellmate was transferred the night before he died. Barr publicly vowed to get to the bottom of it, but I think we all see how that turned out. While teaching at Dalton, Epstein reportedly met Alan Ace Greenberg, who was an executive at Bear Stearns. Greenberg's children were attending Dalton while Epstein was employed. While Greenberg briefly studied at the University of Oklahoma, this was around the same time the psychiatrist Dr. Jolly West was conducting research under Project MKUltra for the CIA. Now, the two never had any confirmation or link between them that we know of, but I do think the timing and the proximity is kind of an interesting footnote. Epstein would be dismissed from Dalton for poor performance, but despite these red flags, Greenberg would bring him straight into Bear Stearns, and at the time, this is one of the country's most powerful investment banks. Remember, Epstein had no degree, no financial background, no license to trade, and former students remember inappropriate behavior from Epstein, including him even crashing student parties. Yet he was still hired as an options trader. Within just a few years at Bear Stearns, Epstein was managing private portfolios for the ultra-wealthy. He reportedly advised billionaires on tax strategies and had numerous amounts of success, which was kind of unheard of considering his background and the fact that he had no formal credentials. In 1980, just 4 years at Bear Stearns, Epstein became a limited partner at the firm. But by 1981, he was asked to quietly leave. The reason was supposedly a violation of the SCE, because Epstein should have been registered with the SEC, but he wasn't. But no charges were filed, no official sanctions followed, and that same year, Epstein would launch his own company, Intercontinental Assets Group. Publicly, it was a firm that covered stolen money from corrupt brokers and lawyers, but Epstein told people different stories. To some, he was a fixer for billionaires, other a bounty hunter for governments, and even to some, an intelligence asset. During property searches, investigators found a fake Austrian passport bearing his photo, a fake name, and listed Saudi Arabia as his main residence. When lawyers were questioned, they claimed it was for travel safety, for him traveling to dangerous and hostile regions. But Epstein was once quoted saying, "I help governments and the very wealthy recover embezzled funds, and sometimes I help the embezzlers." If Epstein was truly moving billions of dollars for foreign clients, this should have triggered SEC action. Regulation D requires disclosure of investors, formal documentation, and oversight. Yet there were no investigations, no fines, and no scrutiny. Did the SEC miss this, or was it ignored? One of Epstein's earliest financial clients, Adnan Khashoggi. Khashoggi was a Saudi arms dealer, a reported CIA asset, and a key player in the Iran-Contra Affair. He brokered illegal U.S. arm deals to Iran using Israeli covert shipping routes. And his connections ran deep. Israeli intelligence, Mossad, U.S. defense contractors, offshore banking networks, and during this period, Epstein wasn't just managing money, he was traveling between the U.S., Europe, and the Middle East, acting on behalf of clients like Khashoggi, moving into circles tied to covert finance, arms deals, intelligence, and during all of this, another name surfaces: John Mitchell, former U.S. Attorney General and key figure in the Watergate scandal. Before he was ever even U.S. Attorney General, Mitchell was a Wall Street lawyer at the same firm that Nixon even worked for. And after prison, he mostly vanished from the spotlight completely, but not from the network, allegedly. According to Stephen Hoffenberg, Epstein was introduced to him in the 80s by Douglas Leese, a British defense contractor close to Mitchell. So we now have a disgraced U.S. Attorney General from the Watergate scandal, a British defense contractor, a Ponzi schemer, and Epstein, who is, again, just a college dropout, just dropped in the middle of all of this. In 1987, Hoffenberg hired Epstein as a consultant at Towers Financial, a front for a debt collection agency. Epstein was given a penthouse in the Villard Houses in New York, which is a really elite area, apparently, $25,000 a month in salary, which in today's money is like $69,000, $70,000 a month, insane, and access to a private jet. Together, they tried to buy out Pan Am, Emory Air Freight, and they borrowed money and faked financials in order to do so, using fake leverage the entire time. By 1993, Tower collapsed. Its losses totaled to $450 million. It was one of the largest Ponzi schemes in U.S. history. Hoffenberg would later call Epstein a co-conspirator, but Epstein was never charged. Hoffenberg would insist that Epstein was protected and even had institutional backing. In 1989, Epstein left Tower and launched J. Epstein & Co. He claimed to only work with billionaire clients, but his only known client was Leslie Wexner, the owner of Victoria's Secret and L Brands. Within a year of meeting, Epstein was granted full power of attorney, which meant he could buy, sell, borrow against, and manage all of Wexner's assets. He managed finances, helped build different things like the Limitless mega yacht, real estate projects in New Albany, Ohio, and he even gained access to the Victoria's Secret modeling world. He attended shows, hosted events, recruited models. Virginia Giuffre testified that Epstein and Ghislaine used modeling promises to lure underage girls with promises of modeling or even entertainment jobs. Instead, they were abused, recorded, or even trafficked. During the same period, Epstein hosted exclusive parties with CEOs, politicians, foreign dignitaries. His circle included people like Harvey Weinstein, Ari Emanuel, who coincidentally both were protected by Israeli-linked firms like Black Cube. Weinstein reportedly used Mossad-linked operatives to silence victims. In the early 2000s, Epstein would also buy a stake in Radar magazine. Some suspect this may have given him influence over gossip headlines, leverage through the media, and maybe even access to potential blackmail targets. By the 1990s, Epstein was surrounded by powerful people, and it was also during the Clinton administration where some report that Epstein worked on currency stabilization policy with Clinton. Of course, this isn't a substantiated claim, and it would require high level of access to Treasury and intelligence. But if it was true, it would suggest Epstein wasn't just handling money, he may have been shaping global financial policy. He reportedly also met Fidel Castro in Cuba, but that's strange considering he had no official diplomatic status. You have to ask yourself, why would some random private financer with offshore operations, again, no real official credentials, why would he be meeting with the head of a communist state? In 1996, Maria Farmer and her sister Annie went to the FBI giving them detailed statements. Details like Epstein had hidden cameras in peephole rooms, the underage girls were regularly brought in and out of the home. Despite all of these reports, the FBI did pretty much nothing. In 1996, Epstein rebranded as Financial Trust Company and moved offshore to the Virgin Islands. This allowed a tax safe haven, which cut his taxes by 90% and allowed for almost total financial secrecy. Now, remember, just before this, he helped run a $450 million Ponzi scheme, allegedly, with zero consequences. Now, there's no evidence his firm was a legitimate investment company, but his firm did show signs of money laundering through strange property deals, abusing the tax haven system to hide capital, and there was no real evidence of investment activity, which checked out considering he wasn't registered with the SEC or even legally allowed to trade funds. From 2000 to 2007, Epstein was president of Liquid Funding Limited. Bear Stearns owned 40% of this company and experimented with repo arrangements backed by home loans. These were the early versions of the CDOs. For anyone unfamiliar, CDOs were kind of a ticking time bomb in the early 2000s. Banks took a bunch of sketchy home loans, they bundled them together, and they sold them off to investors. When inevitably people couldn't pay those loans back, the whole market crashed and collapsed. In 2006, while under federal investigation for sex crimes, he invested another $57 million in leveraged CDOs. When the investors pulled out, it shook the market, and this played a key role in Bear Stearns collapsing, which led to JP Morgan Chase buying it for only $2 a share, and of course the 2008 recession. By 2005, Palm Beach police had built a case that honestly should have buried Epstein. There were multiple underage girls, they had identical grooming patterns, a consistent testimony, physical evidence like photos, notes, names. They were all recovered from his mansion, and this would have been a federal trafficking case. It crossed state lines, but instead it was handed over to Florida State Attorney General Barry Krishker, who later sent it to a grand jury. The result? One charge: solicitation of prostitution. A 14-year-old victim was labeled as a prostitute on paper by the state of Florida, effectively erasing the truth and again protecting Epstein. During this time, Epstein lawyered up with men like Alan Dershowitz, who also campaigned with Trump, Ken Starr, Roy Black, Jay Lefkowitz. But in 2006, U.S. Attorney General Alexander Acosta would draft new charges under the Mann Act, charges that should have meant life in prison for Epstein. But the case quietly shifted. Acosta later told Trump's transition team when they questioned him about it that he was told Epstein belonged to intelligence, to leave it alone, and that it was above his pay grade. Epstein would only serve 13 months in a private wing of the Palm Beach County Jail. During his stay, he was allowed to leave up to 6 days a week, up to 12 hours a day, had a private chauffeur, an unlocked cell, worked in a downtown office under a fake charity organization, took walks around Palm Beach, shopped, and even sometimes went home. And while doing this, his private paid security handled supervision, not the jail staff, and the guards apparently called him a VIP. While this is going on, Epstein's former house manager, Alfredo Rodriguez, had a detailed black book, and in this book detailed names, flights, victims, instructions, and instead of handing it over, he tried to sell it. But the FBI seized it anyway and charged him with obstruction, stating that it would have been extremely useful. Rodriguez got 18 months, which was more time than Epstein served. Among some of the men accused with Epstein was Glenn Dubin, a billionaire hedge fund manager. His wife, Eva Anderson Dubin, who was a former Miss Sweden and even an ex-girlfriend of Epstein, were very, very close to him. They were listed as potential guardians over his children after his conviction in 2008. One of the victims accused Epstein of forcing her to have sex with Glenn Dubin while she was underage. The Dubins deny it, but they stayed close to Epstein regardless of these charges. Now again, Alan Dershowitz, Epstein's lawyer, he was also accused by multiple victims. Now, he denies everything, he filed lawsuits, and he claims he was only involved as legal counsel. Yet we see his name appears in flight logs, sworn statements, Epstein's Black Book reportedly, and he even helped negotiate Epstein's plea deal, which included immunity for co-conspirators. While this plea deal was being negotiated, Bear Stearns was beginning to collapse. Again, by the 2008 crash, it was sold off for mere pennies of what it was originally worth. This was Ace Greenberg's firm, the man who gave Epstein his start. And when Bear Stearns collapsed, so did the documentation, the trades, the client links, the off-book accounts, any potential ties to Epstein's offshore wealth. It was gone. The hedge fund that he operated with no regulation, as this company imploded, the SEC, the DOJ, and the IRS still didn't touch Epstein, and his elite social circles stayed intact. In April 2008, before ever reporting to jail, Epstein took a trip to Israel, where he reportedly met with military research centers, and which that alone raises the flag. Why was he allowed to leave the U.S. under federal investigation, especially under human trafficking charges? In 2008, Epstein funded Carbon 911, an Israeli tech company. Carbon 911 developed surveillance systems that are now even used by U.S. law enforcement. Among these founders included Ehud Barak, who was a former Israeli prime minister, Pinchas Bukress, former head unit of 8200, and other Unit 8200 veterans. Think of 8200 as Israel's NSA CIA hybrid. Let's recap a little bit. The response in a post-Watergate world led to secrecy in government channels that helped intelligence circles go more unaccounted and unnoticed. Ace Greenberg gave Epstein his start through Bear Stearns in the financial world. Epstein leveraged the SEC to operate unchecked. Alleged links to John Mitchell, again going back to Watergate, which leads to armed networks and suggests deeper ties to covert operations. Again, Khashoggi, a CIA-linked arms dealer, was also an early client of Epstein. He got connected to the ultra-wealthy through his clients, and then to Leslie Wexner, which gave Epstein control over his entire fortune, which gave him indirect political access. Epstein then used offshore entities to hide money and avoid prosecution, and the entire time the DOJ, SEC, FBI, and even major media allowed Epstein to skate by for years. After serving time at Palm Beach, Epstein would re-enter high society, mostly through his connection to Leslie Wexner. Wexner wasn't just the owner of Victoria's Secret, he was also a top political donor, funding both parties but had very close ties to high-level Democrats. Through Wexner, Epstein gained indirect political influence, like we mentioned before. Donations that flowed through the Clintons, Obama, and many, many others. Epstein used shell companies and proxies to quietly fund these foundation and campaigns. Many donations going to science and tech organizations with intelligence ties even. And this isn't about party lines, this is about systemic influence. That's something I really want to stress. This isn't a right versus left issue, this is interconnected and goes beyond the political sphere. The problem is there is a continuous elite network that protects people like Epstein. To give some historical background and to show a little bit of a pattern here, another strange scandal to come out of the 80s that is kind of eerily similar would be the Franklin child sex abuse scandal, which revealed elite trafficking and was again buried. And of course, the 2016 Pizzagate controversy. You can laugh and ridicule if you want, but it does reflect the public's deep mistrust in elite groups. And within these elite groups are names like Bill Clinton, who flew on Epstein's jet at least 26 times. He took international trips with Ghislaine, Kevin Spacey, Chris Tucker. I think they visited the White House 17 times during his presidency. And the Clinton Foundation received many donations that are linked back to Epstein and Wexner's circles. Epstein's associates often overlapped with hedge funds, banks, surveillance firms, and these all tied back to Clinton's national security teams. No direct contact was confirmed with Barack Obama, but his administration didn't really disrupt any of Epstein's protection, and the surveillance firm Carbon 911, which again was backed by Epstein's investments, did expand under Obama's administration. Of course, these major donors like Wexner and even the Dubbins, they supported Obama through PACs and bundlers during this time. Joe Biden is another name that comes up often with this controversy. There was a strange real estate and lobbying deal that kind of feels tied to Epstein in some way, involving James Biden, Joe's brother. James purchased land roughly 8 miles from Epstein's Little St. James, and a former Biden Senate staffer who later turned a lobbyist, a part of the Lafayette group, he would buy a portion of the land for James's full investment and then give him a mortgage on that remaining piece of land. So James got all of his investment back, And before this, reportedly, his group lobbied for a deal that rewarded him in a contract worth $5 million. And of course, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who is the stepson of Samuel Pisar, a close associate and lawyer of Robert Maxwell, operated under Biden and other administrations. You're going to notice a legacy trend here, and another name to add to that is Marie Comey, daughter of former FBI Director James Comey. She was involved in the prosecution cases of Epstein, Maxwell, and Sean Diddy Combs. While James Comey was acting as FBI director, he oversaw investigations like the Clinton emails, the Trump-Russia election probe, and other Epstein-related tips. And apparently he has corporations tied to weird intelligence and finance links. And now we see in the news he is being investigated by the FBI for his role in the Russian investigation. Epstein didn't just seek political influence through Wexner's funds, he also tried to build a legacy through science. He funded things like AI, neurotech, and eugenics research at Harvard, MIT, Stanford. He hosted these elite dinners with Nobel Peace Prize winners, tech billionaires, all of these elite notable scientists, people like Stephen Hawking, Bill Gates, Marvin Minsky, Lauren Krauss. Gates even reportedly met with Epstein multiple times after he was convicted, and Epstein claims he helped direct donations to the Gates Foundation. And this isn't about philanthropy. Epstein wanted a genetic legacy. During these dinners, there were even discussions of a eugenics ranch in New Mexico where they would inseminate dozens of women with his DNA through designer babies.
So I'm gonna go throw up, actually.
Calling it optimizing evolution. Epstein considered himself a transhumanist and futurist. And some of the labs he funded would be Joy Ito at the MIT Media Lab, who accepted about $500,000 from Epstein, and other researchers like Caleb Harper, Seth Lloyd, Josacha Bach, George Church, Neri Oxman, and Ben Jaritzel. Again, these are all people linked to major institutions like Harvard and MIT, Stanford. Epstein provided the funding, access, and even donor introductions in exchange for legitimacy. It's kind of ironic that these labs that he funded are now shaping the future. AI ethics, neurorights, surveillance policies. These are the same institutions deciding what's considered abnormal, censored, and flagged within an algorithm. This is just the same power structure with new tools. It's becoming clear that Jeffrey Epstein wasn't just a predator, he was acting almost as a bridge between old school power and the new modern digital age. Under the Clinton administration, Jamie Gorelick would issue a memo through the Department of Defense effectively creating a wall between intelligence and enforcement agencies. Many people argue that this hindered investigations into things like terrorism, creating a problem with information sharing between these different agency forces. You could even argue that instituting a policy like this would make it even easier for a man like Epstein to fly by and coast under the radar. But it gets even darker when you consider that after 9/11, surveillance becomes almost like a permanent, ordinary way of life. 1 week after the attacks, NSA Director Michael Hayden deployed a software to DC, Chiliad. Chiliad was co-founded by Christine Maxwell, Ghislaine's sister. Now, this software would become the backbone of the FBI's investigative data warehouse. It was a data mining software that could finally connect the dots across the agencies, CIA, FBI, the Pentagon. It had this problem with information sharing, and 1 week after one of the worst attacks in American history, they have the solution. Officials later would even admit, if Chiliad had been operational before 9/11, the attacks might have been effectively stopped. And we have to consider that much of the surveillance infrastructure that we have now all links back to Israeli firms, often founded by Unit 8200 veterans, again, which is like Israel's version of the NSA or CIA. Now, as I mentioned before, Epstein invested in Carbon 911, helping the beginning of its funding. But I didn't mention that Peter Thiel was also involved in this project. And this is the same man whose company, Palantir, now powers U.S. law enforcement and even Israeli military targeting systems. Lavender, an AI tool paired with Palantir, scans metadata to select targets, often without even human review. Palantir then helps finalize the kill chain, turning data literally into deadly choices. Tools like Pegasus spyware, Black Cube, and Palantir, they aren't just companies, these are extensions of global intelligence. And Epstein orbited within these networks. Thiel, Reed, Hoffman, Israeli cyber elites, many of these names now holding key roles in AI development, surveillance, and even government contracts. Hoffman, a major founder of OpenAI, shaped its direction alongside Microsoft. Now it runs with closed models and strategic censorship, and apparently privileged access is granted to government and corporate partners. Now remember, Carbine pitched directly to US governments while Epstein was a registered sex offender, which raises a big question. Why was a convicted predator helping the US build national security technology? And I think it's because Epstein's legacy didn't die with him, it just rebooted. Control over data and technology is just the new form of power, and Epstein's network was kind of just one of the blueprints. At the center of his operation was Ghislaine Maxwell, who is more than just his girlfriend. She was a recruiter, an enabler, and a co-conspirator, and the daughter of Robert Maxwell. Robert Maxwell was no ordinary media tycoon. He was likely a triple agent for Israel Mossad, British 16, and even the KGB. He helped smuggle weapons into Israel during the 1948 war, which helped them dominate airspace, effectively winning them the war. He owned Pergamon Press, a major scientific publisher with deep ties to Soviet and U.S. military research, facilitated sales of the spyware PROMIS through complex global networks, including Soviet countries, Israeli intelligence, and even U.S. nuclear labs. He apparently also tipped off Mossad about a whistleblower, which led to their imprisonment of 18 years. Maxwell also was a partial owner of McGraw-Hill Textbooks, a major educational publisher, and their curriculum and textbooks influenced millions of American students every year. Now, Maxwell would mysteriously die after facing exposure over a missing $50 million in pension funds. But instead, Maxwell was found dead, floating nude off of his lot, Lady G Lane. There were no marks on his body, I think just a graze on his left shoulder, but 3 pathologists couldn't agree on his cause of death. He apparently had numerous health issues, lung and heart problems. They couldn't find an exact cause of death, but they were sure it wasn't murder or suicide. And reportedly, the last person to speak with Maxwell was his closest confidant and lawyer, again, Samuel Pizarro. Ghislaine Maxwell returned to England for a short time and then right back to New York, re-entering Epstein's inner circle. It seems like she was more than just an enabler. It appears she probably inherited a lot of her father's intelligence connections and probably even his methods. She ran a system of recruiting dozens of girls for Epstein, accessing royalty, Ivy League elites, and media insiders. She held multiple passports, some British, some French, allowing for travel despite her investigations. And again, among these elite circles include people like Harvey Weinstein, Bill Clinton, Ehud Barak, and Prince Andrew. But she would later be convicted of sex trafficking charges and conspiracy charges and would be sentenced to 20 years in prison in 2022. Now, in the trial evidence, flight logs, victim testimonies, communications, it was all heavily sealed or even redacted. Again, no prominent figures named or charged. Prosecutors confirmed there was a blackmail link, but withheld any details. Witnesses faced intimidation and claim a lot of their statements never really surfaced publicly. It's safe to only assume that these sealed records keep key players hidden and protects the intelligence and political ties involved. It seems this was never really just a criminal case. Powerful networks shielded Epstein and Maxwell to harvest, influence, and even silence dissent. This web spans into Wall Street, the Middle East, U.S. politics, British intelligence, and of course Israel. And at its core is money, secrets, and control. This is the same system that fuels money laundering in Ukraine, elite trafficking in global circles, and all the while Hollywood plays a major role. Kevin Spacey flew on Epstein's plane multiple times alongside Clinton, Maxwell, and many others. He even appeared on a publicized 2002 Africa trip with Clinton on Epstein's jet. Now, many of the victims that named Spacey have died mysteriously, their deaths being rolled as suicides or accidents. Spacey's charges were dropped and the media just kind of went quiet about it. And it just seems like this is all a part of the same system of damage control. And honestly, several accusers and critics died under really strange circumstances over the last few years. Of course, 3 of Spacey's accusers died mysteriously, all within 3 years. Then Anthony Bourdain, Chester Bennington, and Chris Cornell died by suicide after criticizing abuse rings. I think they were allegedly creating a foundation and maybe even creating a documentary depicting all of the details. Isaac Cappy, who named Hollywood abusers, he died jumping off a bridge and no toxicology report was ever released. And then, of course, there's Corey Haim and Corey Feldman. I remember hearing about this a lot growing up. They were abused as child stars in the 80s, with Feldman coming out and naming abusers publicly and then being blacklisted by Hollywood. Jean-Luc Brunel, Epstein's modeling agent, was even found hanged in his cell with, again, weird circumstances like no cameras, no guards, in 2022. Stephen Hoffenberg, if you remember him from before, the Ponzi schemer, died mysteriously after he started speaking out against Epstein, again in 2022. Now, of course, that leads us to August 10th, 2019, the death that started raising all of these questions. Jeffrey Epstein was found dead in his cell at a federal high-security facility in Manhattan. He was under indictment, also under suicide watch, and supposedly in one of the most surveyed jails in the country. And yet, both guards claimed they were asleep or not paying attention. Security cameras outside of Epstein's cell reportedly malfunctioned at the exact moment of death. Not one camera, 2 cameras break, and the third has corrupted footage, and apparently all of these backups have just vanished. And like we mentioned before, his cellmate was removed the day before, which left him completely alone. His autopsy showed broken bones in the neck, including the hyoid, which is consistent with strangulation, according to one of the pathologists reviewing the case. However, the official report concludes it as a suicide. This isn't just some sort of failure, it was a collapse of every safeguard put into place to prevent this exact outcome. And then what followed was a cleanup operation. Visitor logs disappeared, financial records were sealed, and surveillance footage and guard interviews apparently went missing. And of course, the death was ruled a suicide, and we're all kind of just expected to move on. We still have so many questions. Like, why was an inmate on suicide watch left completely unsupervised and alone? No one checking on him until like 6 a.m. the next morning. Why were all of these monitoring systems and cameras disabled or malfunctioning? And why hasn't a single other client or accomplice ever been formally named or charged? Even in death, Epstein protected the system, or rather the system protected itself by erasing him from existence. He was buried in an unmarked grave, no memorial, and apparently he signed a will just a few days before dying. And still today, there are no answers. And that's because the operation was never really meant to end. We were never going to get any answers. We were never going to get the list because all it does is evolve. These deaths aren't random. Whistleblowers being silenced means that blackmail is preserved and the network remains protected. Ghislaine Maxwell sits in prison convicted, but yet no list has been publicly named, and apparently no other co-conspirators. So who did she traffic all of these children to, and who did she traffic them with? Epstein wasn't the start of anything, he was just one of the upgrades. Previously they used wiretaps, but in today's world we use biodata, social leverage, and things like blackmail. And the next phase is industrialized control through predictive AI. And if you want to see how deep it goes, just follow the money. It moved through shell companies linked to Leslie Wexner, Bill Clinton, Israeli intel. The Clintons' foundation aid work in Haiti and Africa appeared to act as a front for influence and possibly even intelligence operations. These operations were barely audited, no real transparency from the government. And again, if you follow the money, a clear pattern emerges. In 2021, DHS and Israel's Ministry of Public Security co-funded a $1.5 million bird homeland security program. Carbine moves its headquarters to New York and expands in cities, partnering with Israeli aerospace industries, and develops a cloud-based 911 system, collecting data from phones, cars, devices. MIT's Lincoln Lab received $38 million through the CHIPS Act for microelectronic defense research. Their Mission Innovation X program connecting defense startups through agencies like the Air Force and even the Space Force. MIT's EDX platform, co-managed with the DoD, trains workers in robotics, phonetics, and intelligence tech. NSO Group's Pegasus spyware is apparently used globally to hack activists, journalists, and rivals. Israeli-linked firms have embedded pre-crime tools into U.S. systems with DHS and DoD approval. And Palantir, that company comes up again, which was seeded by the CIA's In-Q-Tel, runs AI tools for DHS, NSA, FBI, and other government agencies. Cybereason, another Israeli firm backed by Lockheed Martin, runs election security simulations for the federal government. And of course, recently, the big beautiful bill was signed into law, which quietly reshaped AI. And it was reportedly done and drafted with heavy input from tech and intelligence outsiders. However, in the bill, it loosens oversight on government use of AI and ignores core issues around ethics, privacy, and human rights concerns. The problems don't lie purely in the software, it lies in who is getting to write the rules for the future. A recent government memo claimed there is no comprehensive Epstein list, and it doesn't exist after years of court cases, victim testimony, flight logs, Republicans conspiracizing, and even there being a confirmation of a blackmail link. But the government says there is no documentation linking them, but they've offered no real explanations, just a chopped recording from a corridor in the prison that doesn't show Epstein's cell, and claims that all of the video and photo evidence are strictly CP. When Pam Bondi was asked about the Epstein memo leak, Trump cut her off and stated,
"Are you still talking about Jeffrey Epstein? This guy's been talked about for years. Are people still talking about this guy, this creep? That is unbelievable."
And while all this is going on, Netanyahu walks the halls of D.C., securing the largest aid package to Israel in U.S. history. Netanyahu even nominated Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize for his role in the 2020 Abraham Accords.
Express the appreciation and admiration not only of all Israelis, but of the Jewish people.
And of course, the elites linked to Epstein directly stay untouched. No trials, no exposure, not even their name listed. This is just a stark reminder that these alliances run so much deeper than the headlines or even what most of us even realize. It started with covert operations during the Cold War, elites disguising social engineering as philanthropy, people like Robert Maxwell and PROMIS software, CIA fronts disguised as publishing firms, Cold War spies, blackmail mechanisms, and it continued through 9/11, the war on terror, COVID, and now even digital surveillance. It's embedded into your smartphone, the 911 call systems we have. It started after the Cold War. The government began to shift how they view us. First, we were seen as constituents, people meant to manage through policy and persuasion, and then the surveillance ramped up. We became subjects. We were observed, categorized, and even used as test subjects. Today, with algorithms and over-militarized government agencies, we are treated like potential combatants. Threats meant to be anticipated and neutralized before they even act. And every time you're told it's over or you think it's over, the system just reinvents itself. The pendulum may swing left or right, but the wheel only moves in one direction.
We need America to wake up and prioritize Israel and bring home Israelis and make sure we stand by our #1 ally in Israel.